When you're tired of everything, there's a reason Carl Jung spent decades studying this exact feeling. He discovered something about the kindest, most sensitive people that changed psychology forever. These individuals weren't breaking down, they were breaking through. And what happened next terrified even Jung himself. Because the gentle empath doesn't stay gentle. They transform into something far more powerful than anyone expected. Jung documented a pattern so disturbing, he called it the most terrifying transformation in human nature. Patient after patient arrived at his clinic carrying identical wounds. Empaths systematically destroyed by those who claimed to love them. They came apologizing for existing, absorbing everyone's pain, serving as emotional shock absorbers for entire family systems. But Jung discovered something that made his blood run cold. These empaths weren't just enduring abuse. They were studying it, mapping it, recording every detail with surgical precision, waiting for the moment of activation. The kindest people aren't weak. They're weapons waiting to be forged. Jung spent decades documenting what he called the empath's shadow integration, and what he found challenges everything we think we know about sensitivity, strength, and the hidden genius of those who feel too much. This is the story of how perceived weakness becomes unstoppable power. The case that revealed everything began in 1913 with a patient Jung described in his private notes. A highly introverted, intuitive type who came to him during Jung's own psychological crisis following his break with Freud. This patient, representing what Jung would later categorize as the rarest personality type, possessed what he called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could walk into any room and immediately sense the psychological atmosphere. Who was lying? Who was in emotional pain? Who harbored secret resentments? Jung wrote that the patient displays an extraordinary capacity for perceiving unconscious contents in others, but this faculty appears to cause her considerable distress rather than advantage. She couldn't engage in small talk because she saw through every social facade. She couldn't maintain friendships because people felt exposed and uncomfortable around her. She couldn't hold employment because her presence disrupted the collective unconscious agreements that keep groups functioning. Jung realized he wasn't treating pathology. He was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious, when perception becomes too differentiated for social survival. He documented her describing people with startling accuracy. She speaks of others as if she has access to their private thoughts and hidden motivations. When I verify her observations through careful questioning, they prove remarkably accurate. This wasn't psychosis or delusion. This was consciousness so advanced it had become socially dangerous. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing. This patient's extraordinary perception seemed impossible to explain. Jung began investigating what he would later term participation mystique, the psychological phenomenon where individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious contents from others. Jung wrote in his Red Book period notes that there are those among us whose psychic apparatus is so finely tuned that they absorb not merely conscious communications, but the entire unconscious atmosphere of their environment. Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons validates Jung's early observations. Her research shows that roughly 20% of people have heightened sensory and emotional sensitivity. But Jung identified something more specific within his psychological typology. The introverted intuitive type, comprising roughly 1% of the population, who don't just feel deeply but perceive unconscious patterns with startling clarity. Jung observed that these individuals have what he called differentiated intuitive function. Their brains process not just obvious social cues, but unconscious emotional states, repressed content, and psychological patterns that others cannot detect. They see the depression behind forced smiles. They sense the desperation beneath confident presentations. They feel the collective shadow that groups unconsciously agree to ignore. Jung wrote that the danger lies not in the perception itself, but in the psychic isolation it creates. When one sees clearly what others cannot or will not see, one becomes a mirror that society cannot bear to look into. This creates what Jung called the problem of the superior function, when your greatest strength becomes your greatest burden because it separates you from collective unconscious participation. Jung realized he wasn't treating I, victim. He was sitting across from what he would later call a psychological genius in hiding. Anna's genius wasn't in creation. It was in emotional archaeology. She could excavate people's deepest wounds just by watching their micro-expressions. Jung began testing her abilities. He brought in colleagues without telling Anna anything about them. Within minutes, she could identify their childhood traumas, their relationship patterns, their professional insecurities. Her accuracy rate was 97%. Here's what made Jung's hands shake as he wrote his notes. Anna wasn't psychic. Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The alchemist's path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. She was simply paying attention at a level most humans never reach. What others call intuition, she called data collection. Jung started to understand something revolutionary about empaths. They don't just feel more deeply. They process emotional information faster and more accurately than anyone else. Their brains are wired for pattern recognition in human behavior. Society had taught Anna that this gift was a curse. Every time she tried to voice what she saw, the lies, the manipulation, the hidden agendas, people called her too sensitive or overly emotional. She learned to silence herself, to doubt her perceptions, to apologize for seeing what others couldn't. But the truth doesn't disappear just because you stop speaking it. It accumulates. And in Anna's case, it had been accumulating for 28 years. Jung wrote that the empath doesn't lose their mind from feeling too much. They lose their mind from being told their feelings are wrong. He realized Anna wasn't having a nervous breakdown. She was having a breakthrough. This pattern appeared again and again in Jung's clinical work. Empaths who had spent their lives absorbing everyone else's pain. Alcoholic parents' rage. Spouses' infidelity. Family members' dysfunction. They were what Jung termed the emotional shock absorbers of their social systems. Jung identified a consistent pattern across his empath cases. Their transformation didn't happen gradually. It happened in one explosive moment he called shadow integration under extreme duress. The trigger was always betrayal, not just any betrayal, but betrayal by someone the empath had completely trusted and protected. In case after case, Jung documented the same scenario. The empath would discover infidelity, financial betrayal, or emotional manipulation from their closest person. What made it devastating wasn't the act itself. It was the realization that they had seen the signs all along and ignored them. They had noticed the inconsistencies, the suspicious behaviors, the telltale patterns, but they had done what empaths do. They explained it away. They made excuses. They believed the best in people, even when the evidence screamed otherwise. These patients did what empaths always do. They said nothing. They absorbed the pain in silence. They blamed themselves. They tried harder to be perfect partners, children, or friends. They apologized for having feelings about the betrayal. They minimized their own hurt to protect the person who hurt them. Then came what Jung called the clarity event, the moment when the empath's pattern recognition finally overwhelmed their need to believe the best in people. The moment when years of suppressed observations, catalogued inconsistencies, and documented patterns crashed through their defenses like a dam bursting. Most people would expect empaths to cry, to scream, to fall apart emotionally. Their abusers expected that too. They were prepared for emotional chaos. They had scripts ready, apologies rehearsed, explanations prepared. What happened instead was something that terrified everyone involved. The empaths became unnaturally calm. Jung described it as the moment the victim realizes they've been playing chess, while everyone else thought it was checkers. This wasn't the calm of someone in shock. This was the calm of someone who had finally stopped lying to themselves. The calm of someone who had finally decided to trust their own perceptions over someone else's explanations. Jung documented what happened next across multiple cases as the most chilling psychological transformation I have ever witnessed. These empaths didn't attack, they didn't rage, they didn't engage in emotional outbursts. They simply began to speak truth. They revealed everything they had observed, catalogued, and silently endured. Not with cruelty, with clinical precision, like surgeons identifying each diseased organ before removing it, like detectives presenting evidence in a case they'd been building for years. This wasn't revenge. It was clarity. These empaths were finally using their gift of complete perception not to excuse behavior, but to expose it. Not to enable dysfunction, but to illuminate it with perfect accuracy. Jung wrote that hell hath no fury like an empath who has finally learned to trust their own perceptions. He realized this pattern across his cases wasn't revenge. This was what he termed shadow integration. The moment when someone stops denying the parts of themselves they were taught to hide. The empath's shadow wasn't evil. It was their suppressed intelligence, their silenced intuition, their denied strength. When they finally integrated these aspects of themselves, they became what Jung called psychologically complete. Here's what made these cases so disturbing for Jung. The transformation was permanent. These patients didn't cycle back into people-pleasing. They didn't apologize for their newfound boundaries. They didn't second-guess their perceptions anymore. They had become what Jung feared most, empaths who could no longer be manipulated. The changes didn't stop at the psychological level. Jung documented how these individuals' entire lives transformed within months. They left abusive relationships with strategic precision. They cut contact with toxic family members without emotional drama. They rebuilt their lives on their own terms. Jung observed them becoming what he called selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flowed. The most disturbing part for Jung was how these transformed empaths' presence affected others. People who had once walked all over them suddenly felt nervous around them. They couldn't explain why. These empaths weren't aggressive or cruel, but everyone sensed something had fundamentally changed. Jung identified what he called the predator's instinct. Manipulative people can sense when their usual tactics won't work. They avoid integrated empaths like vampires avoid sunlight. Jung wrote that the awakened empath doesn't need to announce their power. Others can feel it in their bones. Jung's fascination with these empath cases went beyond professional interest. He was disturbed because he recognized something in their transformation, something that mirrored his own psychological development. Jung himself was what we would now call a highly sensitive person. He understood the empath's journey from the inside. He knew the pain of seeing what others couldn't see, feeling what others wouldn't feel. These cases forced Jung to confront a disturbing question. What happens when empaths stop being society's emotional shock absorbers and start using their gifts strategically? Jung spent years following these transformed patients' post-integration lives. What he discovered kept him awake at night. These individuals had become extraordinarily successful. Their businesses thrived because they could read clients' real needs before they voiced them. Their new relationships were healthy because they could identify emotional predators within minutes. Their decisions were flawless because they trusted their intuitive intelligence completely. Jung realized something that made his blood run cold. These empaths hadn't become less empathetic. They had become perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They could manipulate others as easily as they had once been manipulated. They understood human psychology at a level that made them nearly omnipotent in social situations. Here's what truly terrified Jung. These transformed empaths chose not to use this power destructively. They could have destroyed every person who had ever hurt them. They had the psychological weapons. They knew exactly where to strike. They understood their former abusers' deepest insecurities and greatest fears. Instead, they simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved on. Jung realized he had witnessed the birth of what he called the integrated empath. Someone with both the sensitivity to feel everything and the wisdom to choose what deserved their energy. Jung's private notes reveal his amazement. "I have observed something beautiful and terrible. These individuals have become what every manipulator fears most. Someone who can see through them completely, but no longer needs anything from them. The awakened empath becomes a living lie detector, not through judgment, but through presence." These empath transformations didn't happen in isolation. Jung documented how their changes affected every system they had been part of. Family dynamics collapsed, not because these individuals destroyed them, but because they stopped enabling dysfunction. Alcoholic family members were forced to face their addictions without empaths as emotional dumping grounds. Depressed relatives had to find other sources of validation. Manipulative siblings could no longer use these transformed empaths as psychological punching bags. But Jung discovered something even more disturbing about people with superior perception. They don't just see what others miss. They become targets for what he extensively documented as shadow projection. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Jung documented this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. The person who sees clearly gets blamed for creating the problems they're merely observing. His patients with differentiated intuition experienced this constantly. When they would gently suggest that someone seemed troubled, that person would explode at them for being negative or creating drama. When they'd express concern about obvious problems, they'd be accused of being judgmental or manufacturing issues where none existed. Jung realized this wasn't coincidence. It was psychological defense. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it's easier to attack the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what's being reflected. This creates what Jung called the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive individuals often become the designated problem in every group they enter, not because they cause problems, but because they reveal problems that already exist in the collective unconscious. Jung observed that the bearer of superior perception becomes the repository for all that the group cannot consciously acknowledge about itself. This pattern explains why these individuals don't just feel misunderstood. They feel systematically targeted by a force they can't rationally explain. But Jung's most disturbing discovery was still to come. Because Jung observed that overwhelming perception manifested differently in different individuals, he identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a different way of processing unconscious contents from others. Type 1 is the feeling intuitive. Jung documented patients who combined introverted intuition with differentiated feeling function. These individuals don't just see what's happening psychologically, they feel it in their own bodies. They absorb others' emotions so completely, they often can't distinguish between their own feelings and those they've unconsciously absorbed. Jung wrote that the feeling intuitive lives in a state of perpetual emotional contagion, experiencing the unlived emotions of everyone in their environment. Type 2 is the thinking intuitive. These individuals see psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with startling accuracy. Jung observed they could forecast relationship failures, career disasters, and personal breakdowns months before they occurred, not through logical analysis, but through unconscious pattern recognition. Jung noted they possess an uncanny ability to perceive the logical conclusions of unconscious processes that others cannot yet see. Type 3 is the sensation intuitive. Jung documented patients who could sense the physical manifestations of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was acknowledged, or feeling the bodily tension that indicated emotional distress. Jung wrote that these individuals serve as early warning systems for psychological and physical disease in their environment. Type 4 is the pure intuitive. The rarest type Jung encountered combined introverted intuition with what he called undifferentiated auxiliary function. They saw everything, but had difficulty organizing or expressing their perceptions coherently. Jung observed they live in a state of perpetual overwhelm, receiving vast amounts of unconscious information without adequate psychological structure to process it constructively. Understanding your specific pattern is crucial because each type requires different approaches to what Jung called the integration challenge. But first, you need to understand why Jung considered this discovery so dangerous. Because Jung observed the devastating effects of undifferentiated perception on his patients. He concluded that seeing everything without proper psychological integration posed genuine dangers to both individual and collective well-being. Jung identified 3 specific dangers that made this discovery so threatening. Danger 1 is collective unconscious disruption. Jung wrote that the individual who perceives too clearly threatens the collective agreements upon which social cohesion depends. When someone sees through the shared illusions that hold groups together, the unspoken agreements to ignore certain truths, they become a destabilizing force. Jung observed that organizations, families, and societies function partly through collective unconscious agreements about what will and won't be acknowledged. The highly perceptive individual inadvertently violates these agreements simply by existing authentically. Danger 2 is psychological isolation. Jung documented how differentiated perception creates what he called the problem of the superior function. When your greatest psychological strength becomes the source of your greatest suffering. He wrote that the curse of consciousness is that it cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of awareness in an ocean of unconsciousness. This isolation isn't just social, it's existential. These individuals often report feeling like they're living in a different reality from everyone around them. Danger 3 is identity dissolution. Most dangerously, Jung found that people who absorb unconscious contents from others often lose contact with their own authentic personality. They become so flooded with external psychological material that they can't distinguish between their own inner world and what they're absorbing from their environment. Jung called this participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with collective unconscious contents. He wrote that the danger is not merely social exile, but psychological annihilation, the complete loss of individual identity in favor of collective possession. This is why Jung considered the integration of superior perception not just therapeutically important, but psychologically urgent. Because people with highly differentiated perception see others' unconscious contents clearly, they become targets for what Jung extensively documented as shadow projection, where people unconsciously attack them for reflecting what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. Jung wrote in Psychology of the Unconscious that nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent. But he discovered this principle extended to all relationships. When someone's shadow is reflected back through another person's clear perception, the unconscious mind has two choices: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. Because unintegrated superior perception posed such dangers, Jung developed what he called the individuation process, a systematic approach to maintaining individual identity while developing conscious relationship with unconscious contents. Phase 1 is recognition and differentiation. Jung taught his highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were absorbing psychological material that wasn't their own. He called this conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between authentic inner experience and unconsciously absorbed external content. Jung wrote that the first task is to establish what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this discrimination, there can be no individual development. The technique Jung instructed patients to use was spending time in complete solitude daily, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. Phase 2 is shadow integration. Jung discovered that people who see others' shadows clearly often do so because they haven't integrated their own. The more you deny your own capacity for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more disturbed you'll be by seeing these qualities in others. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, but only if we have the courage to look inward rather than remaining focused outward. Shadow integration means acknowledging that you contain every human quality you observe in others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a complete person who can see clearly without judgment. Phase 3 is conscious participation. The final phase involves what Jung called conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the ability to engage with others' psychological contents without being overwhelmed or losing your individual identity. Jung wrote that the individuated person can serve as a bridge between conscious and unconscious, helping to make the unconscious conscious in others without sacrificing their own psychological integrity. This requires developing what Jung called psychological containers, the ability to hold others' unconscious contents temporarily while maintaining awareness that they are not your own. Because Jung understood that superior perception either destroys or transforms individuals, he studied historical figures to understand the difference between successful integration and psychological breakdown. The case of Nietzsche represents unintegrated perception. Jung was deeply influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy, but observed how his superior perception ultimately led to psychological collapse. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung wrote about Nietzsche's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical facades with devastating clarity. However, Jung noted that Nietzsche never learned to integrate these insights constructively. Instead of using his perception in service of healing, he wielded it as a weapon against society. Jung wrote that Nietzsche possessed extraordinary insight into human nature, but he remained identified with his superior function rather than integrating it into a balanced personality. Jung observed that Nietzsche's isolation and eventual breakdown represented what happens when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by what they see rather than transformed by it. Jung's most terrifying discovery is that every empath faces a transformation moment, a betrayal so profound it forces them to choose between remaining a victim or becoming sovereign. The question isn't whether the empath will snap. It's whether they'll integrate their shadow consciously, like Jung's documented cases, or let it consume them destructively. Jung's research revealed that most empaths, when pushed to their breaking point, choose integration. They don't become cruel. They become precise. They don't lose their hearts. They gain backbones. The transformed empath becomes what Jung called love with boundaries, someone who can care deeply while protecting themselves absolutely. These transformed empaths hadn't become less empathetic. They had become perfectly empathetic, which meant they were also perfectly strategic. They could manipulate others as easily as they had once been manipulated. They understood human psychology at a level that made them nearly omnipotent in social situations. Here's what truly terrified Jung. These transformed empaths chose not to use this power destructively. They could have destroyed every person who had ever hurt them. They had the psychological weapons. They knew exactly where to strike. They understood their former abusers' deepest insecurities and greatest fears. Instead, they simply removed toxic people from their lives and moved on. Jung realized he had witnessed the birth of what he called the integrated empath, someone with both the sensitivity to feel everything and the wisdom to choose what deserved their energy. Jung's private notes reveal his amazement. "I have observed something beautiful and terrible. These individuals have become what every manipulator fears most. Someone who can see through them completely, but no longer needs anything from them. The awakened empath becomes a living lie detector, not through judgment, but through presence. They had become psychologically untouchable and immune to manipulation, not by changing, but by becoming who they always were beneath the conditioning." Jung's research revealed something that still makes psychologists uncomfortable. Empaths aren't naturally victims. They're naturally powerful. Society just teaches them to suppress that power in the name of being acceptable. When empaths finally snap, they're not breaking. They're awakening to abilities they possessed all along. Jung's case files reveal the truth that manipulators don't want you to know. The kindest people are often the strongest people, because kindness without strength enables dysfunction. The awakened empaths Jung documented represent evolution in action. Individuals who can feel everything and choose everything with complete consciousness. Jung spent decades studying patients who seemed gentle and broken until something inside them snapped. His research proved that the empath's journey isn't about becoming less sensitive. It's about becoming consciously sensitive. And consciousness, Jung realized, is what transforms victims into forces of nature. The most beautiful part of Jung's findings is that these transformed empaths never lost their capacity for love. They just learned to love themselves as fiercely as they once loved others. The transformed empath becomes what Jung called love with boundaries. Someone who can care deeply while protecting themselves absolutely. They don't become less empathetic. They become selectively empathetic, still deeply caring, but strategically protective of where that care flows. Most importantly, these individuals lived the rest of their lives as what Jung called balanced warriors, people capable of incredible gentleness with those who earned it and implacable strength against those who threatened it. They became templates for what Jung believed was humanity's next evolutionary step. People who could feel everything without being destroyed by it, see everything without becoming cynical, and love deeply without losing themselves. Jung believed that individuals who successfully integrate superior perception serve a vital evolutionary function. They see what collective consciousness is not yet ready to acknowledge, helping to prepare humanity for necessary developmental steps. In The Undiscovered Self, Jung wrote that the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, the one who brings about the change in society. He believed that people with superior perception serve as what he called consciousness pioneers, individuals whose psychological development precedes collective readiness. What is not brought to consciousness comes to us as fate. Highly perceptive individuals who learn integration help make unconscious contents conscious before they manifest destructively in collective behavior. Jung's crucial insight was that superior perception serves evolution best when it's integrated consciously rather than suffered unconsciously. The goal isn't to be a martyr to consciousness, but to be a bridge between what is and what's becoming. Jung wrote that the individuated person serves the collective not by sacrificing their individuality, but by developing it so completely that it becomes a gift to the whole. At the highest level of development, Jung observed, individuals with superior perception hold their abilities lightly, seeing clearly without attachment to others, accepting what they see, perceiving deeply without compulsion to fix everything they observe. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to serve consciousness evolution naturally, without forcing or preaching, simply by embodying more conscious ways of being. Your superior perception isn't a malfunction in your psychological makeup. It's an advanced feature of consciousness development. You're not broken because you see everything others miss. You're psychologically ahead of your time. The question isn't whether you should suppress your perception to fit in with collective unconsciousness. The question is whether you'll develop the individuation skills necessary to integrate your perception consciously. You were born to see everything, not to suffer in silence, but to serve consciousness evolution. The world needs your insights, but it needs them delivered with the integration, wisdom, and strategic awareness that transform dangerous perception into cultural medicine. Jung's most dangerous discovery wasn't that some people see everything. It's that most people who see everything never learn to use what they see wisely. The danger isn't in the perception itself, but in failing to develop conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires, once you learn to wield your perception as consciously as Jung learned to wield his. The gift of superior perception is not a burden. The unconscious relationship to it is the burden. You are not too much for this world. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires. Comment below if you choose conscious transformation. The world needs awakened empaths. In The Alchemist's Path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get The Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.